Thank you, James, for that introduction. I'd like to begin with my own acknowledgement of sorts to all the friends and colleagues who made this possible. As James mentioned, I was here in 2016 as the Magana Distinguished Professor. Forget the distinguished, it was just a pleasure to be here. I remember the first time I came to Australia in 2005, and there was this feeling of irreality that one had come all this enormous distance and there was a real place there and people living ordinary lives. And today, as people were making the introductions, I was thinking of a Tagore song, which in Bengali begins, Koto ajanare janaile tumi koto ghare dile thai. It means how many unknowns have you, unfamiliar people have you made known to me? In how many strange houses have you given me an abode? You have made the distant near and the stranger into a brother. And that is the sense that I get now when I come to Australia, and it's truly an honor and a delight to be asked to open this conference, which brings together many old friends, I'm happy to say, as well as people that I'm hoping to meet in the subsequent sessions. Jeremy was extremely generous as an organizer, generous almost to a fault, because I said, what should I focus on? And he said, whatever you feel like talking about. And, what I feel like talking about depends from day to day and, moment to moment. And sometimes it's irritable and sometimes it's reflective. And, I didn't know quite how to pitch it. So the lawyers, one of my degrees is in law. So the lawyer's resort is to turn to dictionary definitions. So crisis of expertise and, what are we talking about? What is the crisis? What does the word crisis even mean? And how should we be responding? So here is a dictionary definition. I was interested to see that the dictionary separates out a medical meaning of crisis, the turning point of a disease, from the more general time of intense difficulty or danger, because I think in our own thinking about crises, that medical definition has metaphorically taken over the entire space. That is, when we say there is a crisis of expertise or democracy, I think there is very much a sense that the thing that is in crisis is somehow on the point of dying, and you need to resurrect it or it's going to be let die. So one could ask, starting with that definition, how does it map onto today's condition or conditions in any sense? If there is a difficulty, what is the difficulty? If there's danger, what are the things that are in danger? What would death mean in any case? People are making somewhat dire statements about democracy, where I most recently come from, and you will understand the reasons why. But in any case, are there possible indicators of recovery? How does one know when the crisis has broken? Somehow those 19th century doctors just stood by the bedside and said, the crisis has broken, and I guess the fever ended. But what is the fever that we're in? And of course, is there a cure? So I think one has to begin somehow with diagnosis before one gets down to the cure stage. And one can look at popular culture, and one can look at a popular culture surrounding the discourse of the moment to see what the uptake is of this moment of crisis. And, one finds immediately lots of things. So this is not the same fake Time magazine cover that the resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue apparently has in his offices, but it is a Time magazine cover. But side by side with it are many other things. First 100 days, we rewrite them all, and it's now well beyond the first 100 days, and the rewriting is still going on, especially in the area of climate policy, as many of you know. Speaks for itself. And then there are different post-truth worlds that people have caricatured, and each one of the blocks in that cartoon has become a meme. But here is a summary statement that I think, to some degree captures the sense of the moment. But it's well to remember from the historian's eye that all this did not happen with Trump's election. To some extent, the debates were going on before. So here is an article dated August 24th, 2016, when many people still did not have any idea that the so-called unthinkable would happen in the election in November. And it's written by a professor at Goldsmiths in Britain. And in detail, he talks about the fact that there is a crisis of facts. So the thing, what is diseased or in danger, in his view, William Davis's view, is a broader crisis of facts. And then he has a diagnosis. The problem is the oversupply of facts in the 21st century. Too many sources, too many methods, varying levels of credibility, and why a particular number is selected. So all of this adds up to what, in the most grandiloquent terms, people are calling a crisis of modernity itself. I mean, of a period which seems to be overflowing with the results, to some degree, of the success of its own prior ambitions. But in this crisis of modernity, Jeremy already mentioned that there's a tendency to blame ignorant publics, but it's well to remember that everybody is playing in this, including the highest level government officials in most of the countries that we know. So this is a very recent story out of Whitehall, which is neither my country nor that of most of you, but therefore neutral territory to be observing on. Steve Baker, one of the Brexit secretaries, makes a claim to MPs after leaked analysis suggests UK would be worse off after Brexit. So what does he say? No, I'm not able to name an accurate forecast, and I think they're always wrong, and wrong for good reasons. My long-standing views on the flaws in the epistemology of the social sciences and consequences for econometrics are long set out. I haven't, I'm sorry to say, done the research to see where his views are long set out and in what peer-reviewed journal. But in any case, this is what he says publicly. So almost immediately, The Guardian, predictably, is on his case. And John Crace writes a column, Brexit Minister brazens out Commons drubbing. And in inimitable Guardian style, Baker beamed with pride as he dropped the words epistemology and econometrics into the same sentence, only for the idiot savant to prove himself to be the idiot. Anyways, and in the same speech, he says that although they don't believe in these results, his office is continuing to do studies to produce yet better facts, but against whose facts? So this is happening out of Whitehall. I mean, you know, this is not the unwashed public out there complaining. It's people denying the validity of their own work in some sense. So the crisis of modernity starts looking like something a little bit different. In STS, Science and Technology Studies, there's a very long-standing concept called experimenter's regress. It is a term that my colleague Harry Collins concocted, and it refers to the fact that if you are a natural scientist and experimentalist and you don't believe somebody's results, some other experimentalist, there are almost infinite opportunities for pulling apart the methods by which that experimentalist whom you want to challenge arrived at his or her results. That's the regress. You can keep going and back and back and back into the guts of the method, and you will never stop. So that is a kind of infinite regress. And the second claim that came out of that in STS was, therefore, you need some foundational understandings about how to go about doing the inquiry. Thomas Kuhn called it a paradigm. There are different ways of thinking about it and referring to it. From a legal point of view, I would say you need some foundational understandings about the normative starting point for inquiry in order to get agreement that the results of that inquiry are, in some sense, believable and trustworthy. So in this crisis of modernity, I think we're seeing not just experimenter's regress, which was, from the STS scholar's point of view, sort of shielded and carefully contained inside of labs until the labs reached understandings about how best to demonstrate something like this. Harry Collins himself went on to write this massive tome on gravity waves and the long-standing controversy about whether gravity waves were detectable or not. But in the public sphere, I think that what we see is a kind of democratic regress. That is a dissolution of the foundations that made people say, well, I believe so-and-so, and I'm not going to go any further. I'm going to take that on faith. I think the democratic regress is that people are unwilling to offer that confidence to anybody, and that is the phenomenon that I think we have to take on board and put under our analytic lenses before coming back to this eternal question of the what is to be done. Well, so where does one begin the analysis? Any good historian knows that there's never a starting point, but there was always Immanuel Kant. And he did write this essay called What is Enlightenment? And in it, he gave a famous definition of what enlightenment is. So enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity, and immaturity, further, Kant went on to say, is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. So you should be self-determining, in a sense, able to make judgments for yourself, and if you understand the starry heavens above, you will be in conversation with the moral law within, and you'll be able to make your normative judgments for yourself. Michel Foucault commented on Kant's idea of immaturity and called attention to the fact that Kant actually gave empirical examples of what being in a state of immaturity means. And it means that a book takes the place of our understanding, a spiritual director takes the place of our conscience, and a doctor decides for us what our diet is to be. Well, by those indicators, we are in a profoundly immature state, especially where diet is concerned, because we depend on all kinds of things that experts tell us. What is our recommended dietary allowance of various kinds of things? What do technical terms like reference daily intake mean? What is the right level of cholesterol, and how many cholesterols are there anyway? What do we do about GM foods? Does that relate also to GM animals, where GM stands not for the car company, but genetically modified? And obesity epidemic, which has been identified as a global problem now, something that the WHO concerns itself with and so forth. But when Mayor Bloomberg of New York, a benevolent billionaire, wanted to regulate the size of soft drink bottles for sale in the city because he was persuaded by the epidemiological data, the people rose up and denied that the government had the power to restrict the size of their Coca-Cola bottles. And they were not reading, Minsky on sugar or, how Coke became a global force or anything like that. It was just a denial that this kind of regulation from above was something that the public was prepared to put up with. But in any case, it just suggests that most of us are, but in those sort of Kantian/Foucauldian terms, not in a state of maturity when we go to the supermarket and decide what to buy. Chile just outlawed various kinds of snack foods. So this is a sort of ongoing preoccupation of government's expertise and who we are as citizens. So how might we resituate the problem today, given that there's no straight linear progression from a state of benightedness to a state of enlightenment and maturity, in that sense of Mündigkeit that Kant talked about? First of all, we have to recognize the fundamental point that science and expert knowledge are not somewhere outside of society, but they're inside society, and they depend on society or are in conversation with society for everything from being allowed to happen at all, funding and patronage, to problem definitions, and increasingly the policy relevance of the inquiries. So if that was always the case, that science always was subject to patronage and subject to state problem definitions and policy relevance, what is different? Size, scale, I mean, to some extent, science's ambitions and aims have grown larger. Just the discourse of the Anthropocene, which I know is quite popular here in Australia, pushes back the range, just the temporal range of our inquiry into human-nature relationships back into geological time. I mean, what we're trying to understand and how we're trying to understand it, these have grown much more sweeping. Science's publics are broader. An organization like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation presumes to speak for global problems, I suppose just as Microsoft Word did in its time. So, global publics are being constructed, expected to march to particular policy prescriptions, and at the same time, the expectations of accountability are different, have increased from all kinds of quarters, not just from governments, but also from stakeholders, the media, and publics, wherever they are. So when experts look out at this scene and feel the sharp edge of disbelief and skepticism and are convinced in their professional subjectivities that they are right, they come up with explanations for what's going on. And there are two dominant explanations. One is bias, and the other is something more Weberian, the rise of technique. So cognitive bias, what is going on in people's brains such that they do not seem to understand or respect expertise, and at the same time, a different explanation that has to do with the fact that we are in an era of hyper-rationality, in a sense, that everything we do is regulated, boxed in, and there seems to be some kind of diminishing of democratic freedoms. So I'll dwell first on the cognitive bias argument and just run through a little bit of the kind of empirical evidence and feedback we have and what that has led to in terms of policy prescriptions. So, those of you who do quantitative social science research might sort of look at how things become parables in the modern world. I mean, somehow the world is extremely complicated, but 2 or 3 or 4 examples become absolutely canonical. So how do we know we're in an era of post-truth politics? It's because people don't believe in anthropogenic climate change, and they don't believe economic forecasts of Brexit-related doom for Britain. And these 2 stories get told over and over again. In fact, they were told by President Obama when he was interviewed around December 24th or something, just before he stepped down from the presidency, and he was being interviewed by David Axelrod, and he was asked about post-truth politics, and he said, here are the 2 examples. So people don't think of it. I mean, it's like religious parables. They get retailed all the time. Vaccines and autism have become one of those parables. So what is the baseline of that story? The baseline is that in 1998, a very highly respected British medical journal published a story which instantly resonated with the parents of children with autism. And eventually enough counter-evidence built up so that the article was retracted in The Lancet. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter to public life. And it continues, that story continues to reverberate in all kinds of ways. Just a fairly recent article in the New York Times about the fact that many scientific articles are getting retracted, and the vaccine article is cited as one of those. Again, quite recently, this worthy gentleman, Robert De Niro, was going to host the Tribeca Film Festival, and he was going to show this anti-vaccine documentary, but under enormous public pressure, he pulled the anti-vaccine documentary from his roster of things that he was going to show at the film festival. Well, this is where democratic regress set in. Why did De Niro pull this documentary? And in an internet site claiming that it's news, truth, and unfiltered, the episode was taken as a form of top-down government censorship. So these are the same kinds of people who believe that the UN is monitoring the middle of the United States and their black helicopters and so on and so forth. But it was taken, I mean, again, because there is no foundational place. The regress goes all the way back. If you don't think there's a government agenda to silence the growing anti-vaccination movement, then you might want to take a look at the damning paper trail that is starting to pile up. And I can assure you the paper trail is not made up. I mean, that is, these are not going to be fictional bits of paper. They will have reality to whoever wants to accord reality. From the expert's point of view, all of this has a very simple explanation, and it is that people just do not get the science. If they got the science, and to get the science, that is the way that it's often formulated. If people did understand the science, then they would believe the experts and not be led off in these fake news, false claims direction. And that idea of the public has gained enough solidity that in the terms of science and technology studies, it's called the deficit model of the public, that the public is continually in a state of intellectual deficit, that is a falling off from whatever that ideal position of understanding ought to be. And this has some assumptions. I mean, so if you wanted to say what are the indicators of this model or what are the elements of this model, you would say that the public's perceptions of risk are influenced not so much by the evidence, but by preset cognitive biases, which produce erroneous assessments of what probabilities really are, at least according to experts, and this leads continually to an inaccurate weighting of relative risks and benefits, and that inappropriateness needs to be corrected through public policy. The aim of public policy becomes then, in part, a herding together of the public back into a state of rationality that is the right rationality and not this other sort of being led astray. I mean, so, you know, it's kind of like sin and Satan, right? Except that you have to wonder who has the authority, like the preacher at the head of the church had, to call people in the congregation back into the belief system. And by what means is this happening? And one of them is nudging, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So all of this analysis, especially the part about the systematic cognitive biases, has gained enormously from the rise of additional sciences, newish sciences, that at least claim to demonstrate this. So it's partly social psychology experiments done by Nobel laureates in economics, among other very distinguished people, and they show that consistently, in certain kinds of situations, people make what economists take to be the irrational choice. So they spend more money than they're supposed to, or they say that the same amount of money has different value depending on how you put the question. So if you put the question to people as you're going to lose $100, they will react a certain way. If you say you will gain, you know, whatever the same equivalent of loss would be, they will respond in a different way. And these are thought to reflect biases that we have, and many biologists are now seeking genetic and evolutionary explanations for why we ended up with these biases. But in the meantime, we also have imaging studies. So the social psychology studies are often done in terms of trolley problems. And many of you will be familiar with this philosopher's game theory in a sense. Take a problem, any difficult moral problem, and imagine it in binary terms, in terms of trolleys barreling down tracks, and down one track you will have one consequences, down the other track you will have a different consequences. For whatever reason, I think because we're five-fingered humans, it's again got a canonical form. Down the one track it'll be one person that you'll hit or kill or damage in some way. Down the other track it'll be 5 people. It's now become for me an amusing exercise when I ask my undergraduates, you know, what's the trolley problem? They all give back this 1 person versus 5 people. They will never say 3 people versus 8 or anything like that. So, I mean, in a sense, this too has become a kind of parable of how you think. So, of course, psychologists, like any other scientists, are deeply creative people. So once you've solved the problem and seen that rational people, given this choice, will always prefer killing the one person over killing the five, they then decided that they would try different experiments, supposing it wasn't just the smooth track on which it was a one-person choice versus a five-person choice. Supposing instead the five people were working on the railroad and the one person was standing up on a bridge, and your choice was to throw down this one person to stop the trolley dead in its tracks, and then you wouldn't kill the five people, would people respond the same way? And lo and behold, they didn't. Initially, it was put in the most politically incorrect way as the fat man problem, that the one person dropped down had the weightiness to stop the trolley. So there was this sort of entry of empirical realism into the scenario building. I mean, you have to think about the degrees of reduction to make this experiment in the first place. All these experiments are conducted on college kids, and therefore they're between 18 and 22. And they're in it for a lark to some extent because they want to see what being in an experiment is like, and so they're given these choices. And one of the sort of side results in one of these experiments was that if you showed them a minute of Saturday Night Live before asking the question, more of them were prepared to throw the fat man on the road. Okay, so but to me that calls for an analysis of the experimental context and the experiment itself, whereas many policy scientists have taken this as gospel truth about the nature of the mind and how you should think about it. And this has led to various things that then still go back to one of those old Kantian ideas. What about the conscience of the individuals, and do we actually rule ours? Do we govern it? Mark Hauser, a since sadly disgraced member of my faculty, was for a while a very prominent spokesperson for this biased brain idea, and borrowing from Noam Chomsky, he said that people are born with a universal moral grammar as well as a universal linguistic grammar, and that the reason that people glom together on the one versus the five is that they have this intrinsic moral grammar built in. And now with brain scans, you can show that, through this phenomenon of lighting up, where the activity in the brain happens, that when people are thinking rationally, in accordance with the standards of rationality that I described before, then a different part of the brain lights up from when they're not thinking rationally. So the object of teaching and learning, and policymakers are great public educators in a sense, is to get people to think with the correct part of their brains, to think in the rational way and not in the irrational way, and you can help them. So this is the most famous early way of helping people to be rational. Some of you will recognize what this is. It's a male urinal in which that black speck was a fly. And as one of the experimenters said, if you give people something to aim at, they will shoot. So what this little device accomplished was in Amsterdam's Schiphol airport, a vast reduction in the filth generated around the urinals, and hence a lessened need for people to carry out a form of menial labor that they were probably not particularly happy to be carrying out. Anyway, a classic win-win result for public policy, which is partly why it became a parable. But what should we think about all this as good Democrats? I mean, maybe we think that these flies are good to paint in, but there is the broader problem. If the way we think about citizens is as evolutionary fools, then what's the purpose of democracy? I mean, what are we trying to do, delegating government to this, body of fools? There's surely there's some way of thinking better about democracy. Nobody, by the way, has answered to my satisfaction how it becomes that some people, the people in the position to create nudge theory or to create the tools by which you herd people into rationality, arrived at their greater rationality. I suppose it's by going to places for degree training like the Melbourne School of Government and the Kennedy School of Government that I teach in. So, pedagogy, education obviously has a lot to do with it, but is it a kind of democratic progress that we train the trainers who then train the next generation, and this is our sort of priestly activity of modernity, that we're ruling out the very possibility of certain kinds of irrationality? Well, so that brings us to the other diagnosis of what is the matter. And that diagnosis is not that people are hopelessly biased, but that people have checked out. They're not interested. And the not interested diagnosis is quite different from the getting it wrong diagnosis, or at least it adds a level. And of course, the great apostle of the checking out hypothesis is Max Weber, who spoke really just about 101 years ago about disenchantment. So in his Science as a Vocation, he wrote about disenchantment, and he said, the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all, by the disenchantment of the world. And so it's not accidental that today, only within the smallest and most intimate circles in personal human situations, in pianissimo, so very softly, that something is pulsating that corresponds to the prophetic pneuma. So there is no spiritual, there is no, whatever the higher aspirations were. Of course, this is completely consistent of this view of the Protestant ethic and the colonization of the future by economic principles and the sort of building in of everything into a kind of rationality of accumulation in the present. I mean, so this is of a piece with Weberian thought in general. But that disenchantment, what can you do in a world in which every step you take is in some way in the domain of these invisible experts who have dictated to you all sorts of aspects of your life? So how do we think about that? So with the disenchantment point as a starting point, I think we might go back to our own analytic resources. What do we think with? And I've already said that conventional wisdom offered us these starting points, the deficit model or lay ignorance model of the public, but added to that media irresponsibility and corporate influence or cover-ups, and a distraction of the crowd in the digital age. That's the most recent sort of overlay on this general disaffection with the public. So the ruler's disaffection with the public is what has produced one of the dominant storylines for why people have entered this post-truth age. And of course, we can talk about this later and throughout the meeting. Each of those bullet points carries a prescriptive edge as well. If you believe that's the diagnosis, you will proceed in a different way. But my own field suggests that there are different places to begin, and goes back to some of the basic sort of things that we think about in the social sciences. So in the social sciences, one of the sort of constant lines of dynamic is between structure and agency. What do we attribute to structure? That's stuff that we can't change. The fact that if you wanted to come to this room, you have only a small number of seating choices available to you. You are arrayed in this semicircular kind of array. Never mind that it goes back to ancient Greece and the amphitheater. If you wanted to historicize it, you could, but nevertheless, you are somewhat fixed in place. Somebody decided what the size and width of a comfortable chair would be, and therefore what the human body is that sits and fits into that chair, and somebody decided what kind of weight it had to bear so it wouldn't collapse while you were sitting, or the floor itself collapse because we're one floor above, and if you put too many people in one place, just think of the infinite numbers of choices that went into the design of this place, and yet once it's done, we give it structural power. It dominates us, and what agency do we have? Well, we can sit in the back like that, or we can sit in the aisles, or we cannot come in at all. So, what is the interplay of structure and agency in the world? And many problems of the social sciences are about that, because we give explanatory weight to structure or agency depending on the problems we're in. So thinking about science and technology now as a problem field, what that invites us to do is to muddle it up. What we took to be structure, take instead as also partly agency. So we used to take fact as a starting point, as part of the structure of the world. It just is or is not the case that human activity is warming up the planet. No two ways. Either it's happening or it's not happening. It's part of structure. But if we say that those structural things that science and expertise give us are not the starting points for thinking about politics, but instead are the end points of a kind of process and politics, how does the world look then? So the end point and not the beginning is one of these moves that we can make with the structure agency argument. Secondly, is it possible to have competing rationalities if how we want the world to be affects, in a sense, how we see the world? Then it could be that with the same state of the world, we end up seeing somewhat different things. I got exposed to this extremely early in my research career. I was doing a 4-country comparison of the ways in which cancer-causing chemicals are regulated. And all my political science colleagues told me this was a stupid problem because I was comparing 4 countries that were too much alike. They were democratic societies, they were Western, they had big chemical industries, they had public health commitments, they had educated publics, they wanted to foster science and technology. I mean, on any of the kind of independent variable that people came up with, these 4 countries, Germany, France, Britain, the United States, look kind of alike, and therefore, of course, they would regulate carcinogens the same way. And the answer was, no, they don't. And so, we had to dig to get behind this sort of competing rationalities. We had a closing meeting of that research project, and the head of the OECD chemicals division came to it. And at the end of the closing conference, we went around the table and said, what is the one lesson that you would take away from these 5 days of meeting? And he said, I would never structure a regulatory system that had carcinogen as an endpoint of regulation. This was at a time when every major regulatory agency in America with a health or environmental responsibility thought that carcinogenic chemicals were the most important regulatory endpoint. So, this was an object lesson to me that these competing rationalities are worth investigating. And then, not unrelatedly, what is public reason? What do people find persuasive? And that is something that is achieved through process and not there to get to as that mountain peak, the Everest that we're all trying to attain. So reason is achieved, not attained, and so how people take up arguments matters, and we need to study that and understand the role of political culture. That then leads us back to the deficit model in a more fictionalizing way, asking what-if questions. So supposing the deficit model is not right, supposing instead laypersons can understand and critically evaluate complex information, supposing laypeople learn, and moreover that they must learn in order to be good citizens in modern complex technological societies and knowledge societies, supposing they have their own perspectives, knowledge, and insights that also deserve respect and are important for good decision-making. So think of a movement like in the US, Black Lives Matter. I mean, nobody denied that Black Lives Matter. It's just that nobody had bothered to make that an issue, and yet it was part of the everyday understanding and consciousness of one segment of the people who had not been consulted in relation to things like, should the technology of body cameras be made universal? So, I mean, there's a conversation all the time between technology and which democracy you're looking at. And supposing people also have room for social creativity and innovation in the ways that they live. If we play that what-if game, we can go back to one of the preconditions of modernity and say, well, why did we trust science in the first place. And the lazy answer is that, well, it's truth to nature. Science gives us an accurate picture of nature. Few scientists believe this themselves. They will point instead to other things like skepticism that we approach with questions. This is why scientists will deny something like the creationist theory of the origin of species and of humans, because there's no room in that theory for skepticism. They will point to humility, that one accepts one's results as provisional, a place of resting that's temporary, but you don't rest there forever. Experimentalism, that you do it, see what happens, take away something and learn from it. And engagement, that it requires all the members of the scientific community to be involved in the same ethos and willing to participate with each other. Well, this looks remarkably like the same prescriptions you would make for democracy. Indeed, there are democratic theories like John Dewey that dwell on experimentalism, civic engagement. Lots of people have written about that. Humility, just read Lincoln's speeches, making incredibly significant decisions, but denying that he had anything other than the power to see the right that had been bestowed on him by God. I mean, so that was a personal taking of responsibility in a sense. So, the skepticism, humility, experimentalism, and civic engagement, and even a kind of truth to nature. How do we perceive the realities around us? In democratic decision-making, if a politician dictates something that is just so contrary to what we want to believe collectively, it comes across as irrelevant, that people just don't want to accept it. So in that sense, my view has been for a long time that trust in science and trust in democracy rest on the same bedrock ethical and political commitments and foundations. So here is an example of what the world looks like if we look at it that way and not through the deficit model lens. So for a long time, and still, in spite of the WTO decision, the one that James mentioned, Europe and the US have disagreed on the introduction of genetically modified crops. And people in political science pose the question this way: Europe was less risk-averse on chemicals, but more risk-averse on GMOs. That is the puzzle. Why? And the standard explanations that came out of political science were Europeans are behind the US, and therefore they never had the debates of the 1970s that we did. That particularly in the UK, it was mad cow disease. That it's European protectionism because Europe is behind. That it's public ignorance of science, and that it's the media and scientists should communicate better. But supposing instead we say that Europeans have some reason, that they actually are no more intellectually in deficit or ignorant than Americans are, that mad cow disease did happen, but we still are not kept from asking, well, how did it matter? And one can come to a different kind of narrative. One can decide that it is in the modes of governance that the skepticism arises. So process matters, how knowledge is generated matters, and nations are not alike in the ways that they think about these problems. Now, I will show you one table which rests on inordinate amounts of my own empirical work, but it's to suggest that how expertise is built into public policy. I mean, to address a question like why Australia ranks, off the charts extreme in loss of trust, I think one would need to have an Australia column here. How are national constructions of expert legitimacy made? How do we come to believe certain kinds of things? And just to have a kind of cutesy analytic handle, I've talked of this as the three-body problem. How much weight do people accord to the body of expertise, the particular kind of knowledge? How much to the body of the individual who is speaking for that kind of knowledge? And how much to the collective advisory bodies through which we reach collective decisions? And it turns out that if you take three pea-in-a-pod countries, US, UK, Germany, the emphasis is different in these three countries in the way that this is detailed in this tabular summation. So that has led me to speculate on something that I call the constitutional role of science. In what tacit ways are we giving science and expertise a kind of constitutional or quasi-constitutional background role, particularly to take things out of discussion? Because all of these countries agree that if there is a scientific consensus or a strong scientific fact or a claim that we have decided to believe in, then we should not politicize it further. So in that sense, that science sits above the normal fray of politics and says, these are the kinds of things we question, and these are the kinds of things we do not question. So we can ask in any system of government what kind of authority science has in relation to other institutions of power. So one can take an Australian invention that the lawyers in this room will recognize, the hot tub approach to deriving expert consensus in litigated cases. One can ask, well, where does this idea come from? Well, I mean, first of all, the hot tub, in Boston, it wouldn't have much resonance because most of the year you can't have a hot tub anyway. But in any case, one can go beyond that and sort of ask why and how science comes to have the particular resonance that allows this innovation to take root in Australian litigation, and precisely according to what kinds of rules of conduct and accountability, what questions do get asked, what questions don't. And if there is this kind of tacit constitutional role of science, what happens when it breaks down, as arguably it did in the wake of the mad cow crisis? I see these disasters as moments when what was tacit becomes apparent, and you have to reconstruct it in some sense. And one can have these localized occurrences, like the appointment of Scott Pruitt to head the EPA in the US, or mad cow crisis in Britain, or the failure of DNA fingerprinting to identify criminals that is roiling southern Germany and the German police. I mean, so one can find these sort of moments of crisis in different countries. What do they tell us about global concerns? Now, fairly quickly and moving towards the end, I suggest that one of the things it calls upon us to think about is whether we need an idea of epistemic subsidiarity corresponding to the very different ways in which established political systems and cultures construct a collective epistemics for themselves. And without, again, dwelling on these, I think one can suggest different ways of organizing subsidiarity. Do we just accept that other people are different and coexist with them? Do we lay on ourselves a further obligation to understand their reasons, which I call cosmopolitanism? Or do we aim for a superarching normative order in which people can hold different views, but the binding norms are the ones that we should be thinking about? If we think about epistemic subsidiarity, we can think about the lay-expert divide in terms of a broader question about margins and centers. And I'm not using periphery advisedly, but it's similar to that idea. So we can pick up the relationship between margins and centers by asking, well, what's interesting to know? And we might want to know, how do ideas circulate from margins to centers and back again? Movement and circulation become significant. We can ask, well, what kinds of questions are we asking and answering? What would the question look like if asked from or about the margins? Is it the case that the energy-starved villager in India would say that my problem is climate change? Or would she or he say something completely different, like, I lack water? How do we do it? From whose standpoint? Is it within the metropolitan places or in the margins that may have their own knowledges? And that could, for some of us, include building in the role of non-humans. And then what is it worth anyway? Is it possible, by shifting our inquiry to those neglected margins, to bring the marginal people, who could be mere lay people or mere something else, back into the centers of power? Recently, I was at a meeting that I had organized myself, and a famous professor from one of the schools at Harvard began her intervention by saying that She had recently learned that 40% of Indians in a survey said that they had never heard of climate change. And her obvious response to that was, well, we need to go out and educate them. But is that the right response? So that puts for us questions for expertise and democracy on the table, and I'm sure we'll be discussing all of these over the next 2 days. How do we reconcile the public good with a constructivist view of knowledge? How do we build collectives if contingency is pervasive? How should doubts be resolved? And note that there's both a local or national and a global significance to each of these questions. How do we think critically about power and hegemony in a world that does have pockets of disenchantment, without question? And how do we remake relations between science and citizenship by putting science off in that tacit constitutional place? We have not theorized the constitutional relationship between science and citizens. It's just sitting there, out there, unexamined. And so my view is that we need, with all due respect, a second Enlightenment, one that rethinks what the purposes of critical inquiry in the social sciences is at this, or what the purposes are at this moment in our time. And, you know, the iron cage has been taken as a metaphor of disenchantment. But if we ask, how did that iron cage come to be constructed, not just we're in it and look, we can't escape, then that allows us to rethink those purposes of critique. And it involves restoring a certain set of opportunities. We're too used to thinking in these binaries, faith versus science, thought versus action, private versus public, lay versus expert. Robin mentioned at the beginning that the purpose of the Melbourne School of Government is to be interdisciplinary. But what does being interdisciplinary mean? Not just putting one economist next to one political scientist, next to a policy analyst, next to a geographer, next to, you know, history, if it's considered a social science. Rather, I think one has to think about the foundational categories in which our sense of the modern is made and constructed in the first place. And it has to be prospective in an imaginative way. What are the futures that we're aiming for and for whom, and how do we design the alternative pathways? So I think we'll be hearing about all of these things in detail over the next couple of days, and I thank you for your attention.
Sheila, just a very simple question. How can we have meaningful democracy in a world of increasing social inequality? Oxfam did a report, I think, about 1.5 years ago that indicated 8 individuals, all men, have now as much wealth as half the world's population. And we have now in the U.S. a multi-billionaire who's the president of the most powerful country in the world.
Thank you very much, Sheila. That was wonderful. With your focus on modernity, one aspect of modernity is the increasing specialization, not just of knowledge, but of tasks and of functions. And that means we outsource trust in others. We outsource responsibility to others for so many things that shape our lives. And so what worries me is how it doesn't seem, maybe there is an iron cage to that, this process of ever greater specialization where even colleagues in my own discipline, I'm not across their area, let alone other disciplines of knowledge. So you talked at the end about bridging, and I think that's absolutely the way to go. So how does one bridge knowledges in a world where there's increasing specialization? It's an absolute locked-in feature of modernity, which is also seeing an erosion of trust in these times.
Is that enough fodder to work with? Like
yeah, sure. You could have gone further about the inequality point and pointed out that this year, when Oxfam produced its pre-Davos estimate, that number had shrunk to 5 to 6 from 8. So, you know, pretty soon there'll be one person who owns the world, and that will be Bezos, I think, because he correctly saw, whereas Gates saw that if you owned software, you might own a huge amount. He owns everything, and, you know, so as long as we're consumer societies, we will be owned by Amazon. Anyway, the point is embedded in your question. It's how does one challenge those inequalities? And we have to understand why it is. I mean, now that we're all too smart to believe in false consciousness, why is it that 38 or so % of the American electoral public still have faith in this multi-billionaire, that he's doing what is good for them? And, you know, what counts as evidence? What is the nature of the alienation that allows people to feel that it's not the inequality of wealth, but the inequality of something else? And one has to conclude that partly I and my kinds of institutions are felt to be the bigger inequality producers, the ones that are harder to bridge, because we are the intellectual claimants and say, sorry, you will never be as smart as us. I mean, anybody could become rich in America. You can win the lottery, you can do various other things, but not anybody can end up going to Harvard. And, you know, whatever the sources of the rage are and the alienation is, I think that that's where one has to bear down. So just saying, I mean, of course, I profoundly believe the premise in your statement that until we have greater equality, we will not have an equal sharing of power. But side by side with that, I think we need to ask, why is it that people put up with the kinds of inequalities that they do until you get a French Revolution? But, you know, maybe French revolutions never happen in America. Maybe you're more likely to go through a period of genuine fascism. I mean, you know, that's certainly a thing that people as smart as Richard Rorty have contemplated, and it's not out of the question. On the specialization point, Robin, so one part of the answer could be fractals. That is, specialized knowledge can still be allowed a certain kind of credence because inside of its own domains, it exercises a kind of responsibility. You know, one of my mundane examples is the kind of streetlight that we've all become accustomed to in the last 10 or so years, in which first you see a walking figure or a stopped figure, but then you get a countdown of seconds. And I ask students if they've ever noticed this, and they never have. I mean, they've never noticed this as a sort of emblematic feature of modernity. And then I say, well, how did the numbers appear in those boxes? And nobody has thought about what? I mean, so, you know, if you're in the city of Cambridge, I mean, did Cambridge outsource the modeling, and to whom? And what kind of credibility did that outsourced agent have? And is that outsourced agent's modeling opaque to anybody because it's protected by intellectual property? The answer to that would be yes, mostly, all the way down the line. But there may be places where we want to intervene because we disapprove of certain things. I mean, so maybe there are certain kinds of decisions that where we do not want the modeling to be outsourced to somebody that is allowed to claim proprietary rights over that, because it is quintessential to the way we live that we understand what is back of this. We've created de facto in America an elaborate system of transparency for the federal government, and then had everybody opt out of it by outsourcing, because the private sector is not open to the same sorts of things. So private data collectors, for instance, are not subject to the same rules as public data collectors, but you can do a very easy pass through by saying, we'll let the private data collectors collect the information. Like every time you stick a hotel key into your door, there's some information being collected. And then we will go and collect that information from these private data gatherers who are not subject to any constraints. So I think if you look into any of these specialist systems of knowledge generation, you will find places which if people knew about, they would get pretty irate and want to do something about it. Of course, you can't energize a populace to be irate about everything all the time, but this is where the specialism of the NGO sector also comes into play. That is, you can have watchdog groups that are looking out for interests in particular areas, and in big areas like food and health, of course we have, I mean, since Ralph Nader's legacy, we have those groups that are specialized to look out for the public interest against a state-generated expertise. I think that that happens in a culturally different and interesting way in different places. So for instance, I think in Indian environmentalism, the idea that you need to offset the state's knowledge through a kind of bottom-up citizen knowledge generation was there from the earliest days of environmentalism. And there isn't a counterpart exactly in the US. So the fractal answer says that just because it's specialized does not mean it's not subject to normative controls. And we have ideas of what those norms ought to be. And we can do the detailed inquiry, if we care about that form of knowledge, to make sure that we're not creating these black boxes that we can't get inside. And if you look across America today, you'll find, the whole military sector is in that kind of a black box. Much of the informational sector, because of the power we've given to private data oligarchs, is in that kind of black box. We can ask for change. And, I think we have to home in on where and how. So, the grand narrative approach that says there is an answer usually breeds a sort of fatalistic stopping point, and the problem looks too huge. But I think that taking it apart, just in the same way that things became specialized, so one can do the pulling apart as well. But it requires us to be smart in different ways. It requires us to think, where can we individually make a difference? I decided long since that my fort was not going to be to go to the White House and carry a mock-up of the Keystone XL pipeline and get arrested with handcuffs behind my back. I myself am better off standing in front of students, one of whom did go and get herself arrested, and so on and so forth. I think those are sort of moral choices we have to make for ourselves about our own capacities. But I also deeply believe that each of us sitting here has the capacity to say, there is something that I can do to alter a state of affairs that is meaningless to me, or that, is perverse to me.
Thank you so much. You've answered my first question, so I've come up with another one, which is really, I think, picks up on where you finished there. What's the role of universities in this environment, where universities, including this one, are now businesses? The Melbourne School of Government, like any school of government, including Harvard, has sponsors and patrons, and is enmeshed in a web of relationships that are challenging in many ways to what some people might consider to be academic autonomy, integrity, and freedom. So I'm really interested in where you would take your analysis and put it in the context of what we as scholars, some of whom of us are, activist scholars, others not, but what we should be really thinking about our role as being in these institutions which are themselves somewhat compromised.
My question, what I think has changed so fundamentally is the absence of Walter Cronkite, a credible center on CBS, so that you combine social media and algorithms that detect and then reinforce what you think. And so one's forever driven further and further apart.
Yeah, well, thank you for both of those questions, which go to the heart of many of the things that I think about, and I'll try to be brief. So, yes, absence of Walter Cronkite, but that's another of these parables. Because Walter Cronkite didn't look much like me, and he didn't look much like the people who think that storytelling from the centers of media authority repeatedly excluded certain things. So I think, without denigrating Walter Cronkite, he stood for a set of things, and his response right after the Kennedy assassination was undoubtedly one of the sort of salves for a fractured nation. That it was one of those important media moments. And my own sort of ethical position here is that one should not deny the compromised virtue of a past that one has come to see as compromise. That is, nevertheless, there may have been virtue. But today, if we really want to think about how we want to think today, there's not a going back. I mean, you can't say that somebody who represents a kind of ideal citizen or spokesperson, you know, father of the nation almost. Cronkite was always referred to as a father figure in the media. That is not the way to achieve credibility today. I think we really have to put on the line something that we've forgotten to think about, which is what is a collective good. And there are many analyses of these, but one of them puts the problem into the heartland of liberalism, and particularly in America, and says that the focus on identity politics has fractured and fragmented notions of the good to a very thin phenotypic understanding of what the good is. And that even if you look at something like feminism, which is based on, after all, one of the big phenotypic differences, that there were always different feminisms, and the fissures and fractures between them, such as the inequality question that you raised before, were not adequately ironed out. And what a highly endowed, you know, Sheryl Sandberg type of woman sees as wrong with the world, well, I mean, if you're into reading this kind of literature, you will find in the debate between Anna Marie Slaughter and Sheryl Sandberg a standoff between two sort of very successful women thinking about feminism and the woman's place in radically different ways. So I think that, you know, we need to pay attention to where we're going to create those discussions and debates. And it's not by excluding voices from campus. And it's not by failing to write about certain kinds of things because they're uncomfortable. And that circles back to the role of the universities. So yes, of course, many days I feel that the corporatization of the university has left very little space for critical discourse. But nevertheless, you know, when you look at other kinds of organizations, we have a great deal of freedom. And the problem that I see in my own university is to some degree the complacency of the citizen and the Weberian disenchantment. I mean, you know, it's become a sort of standing joke of mine that, you know, as a university in which I may be the only senior faculty member who still wears a sari, I am the least fatalistic of all of my colleagues. And so, you know, if I were to write a Protestant ethic for today, I would call it On Fatalism. And, you know, why my colleagues put up with certain kinds of things. Well, you need to band together. You know, it's easy to band together if you are part of Me Too or part of BLM or whatever, there are ready-made coagulations. It's much harder to band together around abstract ideas. And I spend a great deal of my time building collectives that will, to some extent, transcend the fatalism, often of my very highly successful male colleagues, and, you know, and try to think of how we can carve out a space in which universities stand up for the courageous speech and the training of the young in less complacent forms of understanding and behavior. You know, at that level, the 60s ethic of distrusting authority is probably baked into my own ways of looking at things. And I find my 20-something-year-olds astonishingly complacent from the standpoint of my own generationally different point of view.